Today I'm going to take you through the steps required to build a gaming desktop PC. I've got a set of parts here and I'm going to take you through the installation to build a i7 GTX 980 gaming PC with a solid state drive, a hard disk drive, some DDR4 RAM, a power supply unit and some cooling systems inside the chassis that I've borrowed from the physics department. So let me take you through the parts we're going to be using. Here is my Z170 Pro gaming motherboard. Here is my USB stick, which has got a preloaded installation version of Windows 10 on. I've got some silver paste and some chassis screws, also a small speaker that came with the motherboard. I've got a 1TB WD hard disk drive. I've got the CPU, which is an i7 6700. I've got a crucial 500GB SSD. I've got an NVIDIA GTX 980 graphics card. I've got some SATA cables. You need the same number of SATA cables as you're going to use have drives, so I've got 3 of them, got one spare. I've got some Vengeance DDR4 RAM. I think each of those are 4GB. I've got a few cooling fans that I've sourced from some other physics machines. I've got the power supply unit. This is a 750 watt PSU that comes with a power cable. And I've got a chassis that I've taken from an old physics department PC. That's everything that you need to build your own PC. So let's start with inserting the most important thing in the build, the CPU. Here is the motherboard and here is the CPU socket. You'll see all of the pins which connect to pins on the bottom of the CPU. The Intel chips are in a different shape to the AMD chips, but all of the Intel boards operate in the same way. You push this metal catch down, lift it up, bend it to the side, and the flap opens and you can see all of the pins where you can load on the CPU. Here is my CPU. You've got to be very careful when you handle these CPUs. Try not to touch any of the gold pins on the bottom and try not to get any grease on the top. So just hold the CPU by the sides like so. When you insert the CPU, you've got to be sure that you get it in the correct orientation. Now there are several marks on the outside of the base plate of the CPU that help you localize where it should be placed. 2 edges of it have got a small dip in, a small semicircular dip there and there. And one corner has got a gold triangle on. That gold triangle allows you to locate it on the base of the CPU board, because you'll also see a triangle on most motherboards there. So I can line up the CPU with the making sure the semicircles are in the correct place, and then you'll feel it kind of slot into place. And you can check that it's roughly in the correct place by just giving it a slight wiggle. You'll feel the smallest wiggle from side to side, but you'll feel it slot into place. Then when the CPU is in, you can fold the cover shut, put it underneath the screw, and fold the handle down to secure the CPU. That's the most important part of the build complete. Okay, the next part of our build is going to be to install the CPU cooler. The CPU cooler is normally a large heatsink with a fan on. I'm going to be using the Intel stock cooler that came originally with the motherboard. You can buy fancier coolers, but this is a nice simple one which works pretty well. I'm not going to be overclocking this machine, so I probably don't need it to be too beefy. The heatsink will help to carry heat away from the CPU. That's the objective. On the bottom you'll see a base plate which will fit with the seat on top of the CPU. But before we install the cooler onto the CPU, we need to use some thermal paste. So this is Arctic Silver thermal paste. This should be used as a bridge between the top of the CPU and the base of the cooling unit. And when you apply the thermal paste, you need to put a small pea-sized section near the middle of the CPU. You don't need to spread it out all over the top of the CPU, because once the cooling plate has been squashed on top, that will help to spread the thermal paste. Each of these coolers are different, so the way that you'll mount yours may be slightly differently. This one's easy because the motherboard has got the holes drilled that fit exactly with the securing pins on the intercooler. But if you've got a fancier cooler, Here's one from an old gaming PC, which I'm not going to fit today. And this one has a more complicated fit on the bottom that you need to use some extra mounting brackets for. So follow the instructions that came with your cooler if you've got a more complicated one. You take the top off, and then you just want to put a small amount of CPU cooler near the center of the CPU. About a pea-sized unit is fine. And then when you load the cooler on top, it will then help to spread out the thermal paste. And this thermal paste aids conduction between the CPU and the heatsink. So we load the CPU cooler over the top so that all of the pins on the cooling fan slot into the pins on the motherboard. Okay, I'm going to push these pins in so they click. And once you've loaded the pins through, you'll see on the bottom of the motherboard that the connection pins get pushed through, and then when you turn the securing pins, that pushes through a black bit of plastic which will hold the pins onto the back of the motherboard, one at each corner of the CPU. So now the CPU is on securely, I'm going to adjust this cable such that it's not going to obstruct the fan when it's spinning. And you'll see on the motherboard there's a port labelled CPU fan. In this motherboard it's over here. So this is where I'm going to put the connection for my cooler, making sure that you put the ridges on the correct side. And you'll feel it will slot into place. And then you can just tidy the wires up slightly. That's the CPU done. Okay, now let's install the memory chips, the RAM, which go into these slots here on the other side of the motherboard. So there's space for 4 slots. I've only got to install 2 today. I've got these 2 Vengeance DDR4 LPX chips. These are going to go into 2 of the slots. Now before you install the memory, make sure that you know which of these 4 slots you're going to be using. Different motherboards have different configurations for which slots you should use. I've just done a Google search for the name of this motherboard, the Z170 Pro, and I've been presented with this image which shows exactly which 2 slots I should use. So I've been told from the instruction manual that I should be using, with 2 memory chips, I should use DIMM A2 and DIMM B2. So looking at the side of the slots, I can see A2 and B2 are this bottom slot and this one here. So A2 and B2 are there. You'll see on either or both sides of the DIMM slots you have a latch that can be flicked backwards and forwards. This helps with the installation of the memory modules themselves. Before you push the RAM slots in, make sure you know which way round they go. You'll see that there's a gap in the pins on your memory chips which matches with the gap in the slots on the motherboard. So make sure you try to push them in the correct way around. So when you hold them here, you'll see that the latch doesn't match up, but when you rotate them round, now the latch is in the right place. You flick the retainer to the left, then the RAM will slot in nicely either side of the, and when you give it a slight push, you'll hear a click, and that's now in there securely, and the clip on the right has now moved in. I can now put the second one in using the same method. Make sure I get it the right way around. Pull the pin out, hold the RAM up to the slot, slide it in, give it a push, and you'll see a click. And that's now both of the RAM chips installed. Next we've got our case, or our chassis. Here's one of the old physics department machine chassis. I'm going to pull the side of the chassis off by just sliding it towards the back, and then it should clip off. It may be hinged. Some chassis have a hinged side instead. Most of them will slide off to the side. Now is a good time to install your I/O shield. This is a piece of metal that can be slotted inside the input and output bay of your case. It stops dust coming into the case. This will not actually fit this motherboard, and I've lost the shield for this case because it's such an old machine. But now is a good time for you to install this IO shield that always comes with a motherboard. So to get your chassis ready for an install, tip it onto the side so that the back plate is on your desk, so that the motherboard will slot in nice and easy into the box. Here is the inside of the chassis. You'll notice several things about it. First of which is that you'll see several riser pins which are already inserted into the inside of the chassis. Most cases will already have these installed for you. You may have to install these yourself onto the grid of holes that you'll see, and these should match up with the placement of the screw sockets in the motherboard. So when you hold your motherboard up to the inside of the chassis, you should be able to match up these riser pins with the screw holes on your motherboard. But you may have to move these around if they're not in the correct place already. You'll also see a load of cables inside. These cables are normally the input and the output to the chassis. Things like the USB slots on the front of the case, the power supply switches, the reset switch, the hard disk drive light, USB 3 ports on the front, fans, etc. This case already comes with the fan in, which is already installed in the front, but I'm going to install an additional one into the back, both of which will be powered from the motherboard. So to install the motherboard, you should line up your motherboard screw sockets with the same sockets that you see inside your chassis case. So make sure you've moved all the cables out of the way so that you're not going to obstruct the placement of the motherboard. So when I lower my motherboard in, I should find that the screw holes in the motherboard line up almost perfectly with the sockets on the inside of the chassis, and you'll see that they'll line up. When you look through each of the screw holes, I can see the risers beneath all 9 of those. Now I just need to go through and install the screws on all of these sockets. And this motherboard came with a small set of screws for securing it to the chassis. So let's go ahead and screw all of those in. So now the motherboard is pretty secure. I can check it's stable. Appears to be firmly attached to the base, ready for the next stage of the build. So next we're going to install the power supply unit, PSU. Here's the PSU for this machine. It's quite a beast. It has loads of connections for hard drives, for CD drives, solid state drives, graphics cards, motherboard power as well. We're going to use very few of these in our build, but many of them will come with removable attachments. Some of them will come with them already fitted. This one comes with them already all fitted. This is a Cougar 750 watt power supply. You'll see that in this chassis, the power supply unit has got to go at the top. So we're going to leave the chassis facing down and install this unit. The power supply units normally either slide in from the back, or you've got to slide them into the socket from the inside. In this case, I can see there's a bracket around the outside, which means you've got to install it from the inside. So we're going to hold the unit in close to the socket. Now we've got to work out whether it goes up this way or this way. So looking at where the screw sockets are, I can see that this one is lower, which means it's got to go this way around. When you hold the power supply unit in, bring it up to the back, you'll see that the 4 screw holes line up with the sockets. We're then going to install the PSU using the screws that came with it. Take a couple in here. Don't need to be too tight, nice and firm. And there we go. Okay, so now the PSU is installed, we want to connect the front connections. So on most chassis you'll have some buttons at the front which will allow you to plug in your microphone or your headphones onto USB ports. And those cables will all run through the center of the chassis and then can be connected onto the motherboard themselves. So let's do that before we connect any of these cables. So I can see that all of the USB connections are coming in from here. These cables down here are going to be the different power supplies. Okay? This is the fan connection. So feel some more of the connections. This is the power supply for the reset button and the power switch and the power LED. This is the USB 2 slot on the front. This is the LAN connection on the front. This is called HD audio. So HD audio connects with what's labeled on this motherboard AAFP. Your motherboard will have a different name for it, but this one's called AAFP. And when you're connecting these connections, look at the top. You'll see that often they're missing one of the blocks, which will match up with a missing pin on the motherboard, which makes sure that you're connecting it the right way around. So let's put HD audio in first because it's furthest away from the others. Next, I'm going to connect the second chassis fan, which is called CHA Fan 3. There's normally 3 or 4 fan slots around the motherboard. I'm going to use CHA Fan 3, Chassis Fan 3. There we go. Okay, next I'm going to connect the USB 2 port, which is labeled USB 2.0. That can go into the port labeled USB on the base of the motherboard. Now this is the section that can get a little bit fiddly. You'll see down there, there's a series of pins which have labels on. And if you look on the side of your motherboard, you'll see that they're labeled things like HDD, LED, power on and reset, which match up with the labels on the pins coming from the front of your chassis. So I have 2 pins for the reset switch, 2 pins for the power LED, plus and minus, 2 pins for the HDD, LED, and 2 pins for the power switch. So make sure you get them in the correct positions on this board. So you can also look at the instruction manual for your motherboard, which will also contain the diagram of that setup. I've just searched for my motherboard again, and here is the instruction manual, the first Google result. You'll also see a speaker pin, so I can put in my speaker there, which can help alert me about problems with the PC when it starts booting. Next thing I'm going to do is install the fan on the rear of the chassis. Now this fan already comes with a mounting bracket, which makes it even easier to install. So I can hold the fan, I think it goes this way, and hold the fan up to the mounting holes, twist them in, and then slide to the left. Easy as that. Some fans are a bit harder and will require screwing in, but most chassis come with a set of screws that you can use for that. And near the back, you'll see something called CHA Fan 1, which stands for Chassis Fan 1. So on my motherboard, it's there. CHA Fan 1, and I can connect my chassis fan like so. Okay, so next I'm going to install a solid state drive and a hard disk drive. Here's my 1TB Western Digital HDD and my 500GB Crucial SSD. These are much faster, but these are still a lot cheaper in 2020, at least for now. The hard disk drive will install in a bracket. Most chassis will come with a bracket specifically designed for holding these hard drives, and they'll come with a set of screws that you need to use to apply them. The hard drive will simply slot in, making sure the connection cables are at the back. The power cable, the hard drive will slot into any of the brackets in the front of the chassis. I'm going to choose one which is close to the motherboard, so the cable has to travel a lower distance. Slide the hard disk drive in. Like so, and then apply the 2 screws at the side, which will hold the hard disk drive in place. And the same thing for the SSD, except I need an extra bracket for my SSD because it's too small for this particular chassis. Most new chassis will come with a set of plates that you can use to fix SSDs on, which will allow you to slide them into the same brackets. This one doesn't have that one, so I'm going to just connect mine for now, but you should install your SSD, if it's smaller than 3.5 inches, install it on a separate mounting shelf and slide it in exactly the same way. You'll also have a series of SATA cables. These are the cables that connect your hard disk drives and your solid state drives to the motherboard. And the motherboard itself will have a sequence of SATA ports on the side of it. So you need to use your SATA cable to connect the SATA points, which are here, for example on mine, to the SATA connections on the back of your hard disk drives or solid state drives. The next thing I'm going to do is to install the GTX 980. Importantly, when you're installing graphics cards, look at how many bays they have. When you look at this GTX 980, it's got 2 rows, which fit with the 2 rows on the back of the chassis. So you've got to make sure that you have removed some of the cases on the back. But each of these bays is normally home to a different card. They can install things like PCI cards and network cards and extra USB ports and that kind of thing. Here is for example, a 5.1 audio card that came out on an even older PC. This is a Sound Blaster Audio G2 5:1 audio card, and this will also slot into one of these bays on the back. Normally it's the upper PCI slot that's the default, but again, check this with your motherboard instruction manual. When you lower the card in, make sure that the pin has been removed. Just like the same way that we did with the RAM, you'll see a pin there which has been depressed to the side, which makes it easier for the graphics card to slot in. When I then push the card in, you'll hear a click, and the slot then lifts back up again. There's a slot for screws there, which you should then apply, hold the graphics card securely in place. So the final part of the setup is to connect the cables from the PSU to the motherboard, the graphics card, the solid state drive and the hard drive. This particular ATX motherboard has 2 power connections. One is the standard 24-pin power cable, and there's a secondary ATX specific power connection near the top of the motherboard. And then once your hard drives, your power connections and your graphics card are in, you are all done. You can now tidy up the cables a little bit. Often chassis have a rear portion that you can use to tidy the cables. You put the chassis case on, plug it in, switch it on, and we're ready to go.